And today we have the pleasure of Skyping in our Google Hangouts with Ronnie Barkan, who's a Jewish activist that lives in Israel and Germany, I believe. And he's co-founded a group called Boycott from Within, I think back in 2007 or 2008. Yeah. So, and he's going to tell he's going to tell us a little bit about that. So please help me welcome Ronnie.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Happy to be seeing some of you and talk to you. I did a little Googling in the meantime, because I want to drive the message home. So maybe let's see if I can share a little presentation with you. Let's try that. Azim, can you help me? Because I'm pretty much using Hangouts for the first time. Should I just do screen share?
Yeah, I think if you do screen share, you should be able to grab.
Sure. Let's see that. Let's see if that works. Screen share. I just click that. No. Can you see my screen at the moment? Probably not.
No, we only see you.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, we can do without. How about I share? It's a Google slide thing. So how about you put it up on your computer?
Yeah, that works.
Does that work?
Yeah.
Okay.
You can just email it to me if that works, or.
Sure. Here, let me just share a link here on the chat.
Oh yeah. That.
Okay. So I'm just sharing the link.
I have it up now on my end.
Okay, it's great. So I had a little time to search, and I was wondering which were the indigenous tribes living in Oregon, where you're sitting today. And I see that you have something to be proud of the University of Oregon for actually acknowledging Indigenous Peoples Day. And from whatever I managed to see, I mean, there is yes, there is definitely some progress in actually acknowledging the legacy of the Indigenous people who are living there. And that kind of warms my heart. So I think that is kind of where I wanted to start. I think that that is something for you to be proud of. And I would like to talk about the difference between the situation over there and the situation in Israel-Palestine today, based on that. I come from Israel-Palestine. I call it Israel-Palestine, or usually just Palestine, because basically it is not that you have an Israel alongside Palestine. Rather, the state of Israel was built on top of Palestine at the expense of the indigenous Palestinian people. That's how it was established. So whenever you hear in the media about an Israel and a Palestine, for example, that's already a misleading, if not totally false notion. Same goes for many other things that you may have read in mainstream media. So part of what I would like to do is to today, in the next minutes, is basically to undo some of the propaganda that you may have been exposed to if you've been reading the New York Times or Haaretz newspaper or all kinds of media outlets like that, and to talk to you about what the situation in Israel-Palestine is really all about. So usually when I introduce myself, I say that I like to think of myself as a conscientious objector and a member of the Palestinian popular struggle, which struggles for the basic rights and so on, and are joined by a handful of Israelis and internationals, conscientious Israelis and internationals, and also primarily a member of the Boycott, Divest, Sanctions campaign, the BDS campaign, which is about demanding the basic rights of the Palestinians, which are protected by international law and human rights conventions. So that's how I would like to think of myself. But another way to introduce myself, and whether I like it or not, that would be the correct definition, is to simply say that I'm a privileged Israeli Jew. More precisely, I'm a privileged white male Israeli Jew. Now, these are not things that I have chosen. I did not choose to be born in one way or another, nor which regime I was born to live under. But my legal definition in the state of Israel is that I am, as mentioned, a privileged Israeli Jew. What do I mean by that? It means that everything that the state of Israel does since its very inception to this day is about giving privileges to people of my ethnic background, and doing so at the expense of the others, who also happen to be the majority, just that most of them are denied from living on their land. So this goes back to my first slide about, okay, checking what is the acknowledgement. The first step of overcoming all of this is to acknowledge the wrongdoings. And I can clearly say that Israel does not wish to acknowledge its wrongdoings. I think that in the US, there's the first steps of doing that. And it is very encouraging to see that in Oregon, they have taken the first steps to acknowledge the rights of those indigenous people, the majority of whom have been genocided. In the Israeli case, Israel, when it was established, did not opt for genocide. It wasn't as popular at the time, so they opted for the second best solution, which was to ethnically cleanse the land, to drive away the indigenous people from their land. Since its inception, since they basically drove away the people from their land in order to create their cherished ethnic majority at the expense of the indigenous people by driving them away, since then to this day, these people are either denied the right to come back home, or denied equal rights, or the same rights that I have under that regime. So this is what we're struggling for. We're struggling for the rights of the indigenous people who are still there, because there was no genocide taking place. There was a very serious case of ethnic cleansing, but these people are still there to demand their rights. And this is what we are here to discuss, these basic rights of these people who are still here to speak up and to demand their rights. So maybe we can move on to the next slide.
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah, you got it? Okay,
Yeah.
so let me have a look. What are you looking at? Okay, so that's Martin Luther King, I guess.
Yeah.
And MLK, in his wonderful speech, in his wonderful letter from Birmingham jail, he writes the following. He says, he talks about what he refers to as the white moderates. And he says, I've always reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. And I don't know if you can see that. Maybe you can hit the spacebar or something. I carried on quoting just a little more from the rest of the letter, and he talks about the white moderate who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom. So what I would like to say is that, first of all, when we talk about overcoming whatever Israel is doing today, we need to think about the rights of the indigenous people, and we need to demand that that type of peace that we are yearning for will not be just a way to control the situation, but actually to seek justice, to seek the rights of all the people of that land, and to remedy as much as we can the wrongdoing that has been carrying on for at least the past 7 decades. So we can move on to the next slide. Now, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the situation in Israel-Palestine. If you are, you may be familiar with this set of maps. There's 4 maps on the screen, I hope.
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. Yep. And these four maps tell us the story about the annexation of land, since before the foundation of the State of Israel to this day. It is very useful because it pretty much tells the story about how the land has been annexed and how Israel or Palestine was transformed into Israel. But it actually doesn't tell us the main part of the story, because the main part of the story is not about which land or how much of the land is being occupied or controlled, but rather who are the people living on that land. And I'd like to focus on just one example. If you can switch to pretty much the next step of that slide.
Yeah.
You may be seeing one map with the numbers on the both sides. This is the partition plan, the famous UN partition plan of 1947, deciding to partition that land, which was under British mandate, into two parts. One on the right side was supposed to be a Palestinian state, and on the left side was supposed to be what they refer to as a Jewish state. It is not Jewish by religion, it is possibly Jewish by ethnicity. Now, I don't refer to Israel as a Jewish state, I refer to it as a Zionist state, and I'll explain why in a moment. Now, the problem with that plan was, first of all, that it was very unjust, because at the time of that partition plan, only 1/3 or even less, 30% of the population were actually ethnic Jews. Most of them were actually newcomers to the land, colonizers who came to basically to usurp the land, to take over control, etc. And they were given more than half of the land. They were given 56% of the land. So that in itself was already a very unfair decision. But that plan actually was never materialized. It never came into being. People think that the land was divided into two parts, and if you listen to the Zionist hasbara, the Zionist propaganda, they say, well, you know, the Zionists accepted the partition plan, but the Palestinians rejected it, and, you know, tough luck. But actually, no party accepted the partition plan, because the Palestinians obviously rejected it for a good reason, because no indigenous group would accept to have more than half of their land given to the colonizers who came to usurp the land. But also the Zionists did not really accept that, because what the partition plan also says, and people tend to forget that, is that it protects the rights of all the people living on that land. So what are the numbers here? The 700,000 Palestinians on the right-hand side of the map had to be, you know, they had to receive equal rights. And also in the so-called Jewish state that was supposed to be established on the left side, on the white area, there were supposed to be 600,000 ethnic Jews and another 500,000 Palestinians, and they were all supposed to have equal rights, regardless of race, gender, religion, ethnicity, and so on. This didn't fit with the Zionist type of thinking, with the Zionist project in Palestine. It went against everything that project was about. Because not only that the Zionist project in Palestine is a colonialist project, which comes to take over, to usurp the land, and so on, it is also inherently about exclusivity. It is also inherently about saying that this is ours and only ours. And anyone who doesn't belong to our ethnic group doesn't belong here at all. Anyone to this day who is a member of the other group or groups is regarded as some sort of a problem that at best has to be tolerated. So for the Zionists, they didn't accept that partition plan, and what they did in practice was something very different. What they did in practice is actually to create a Jewish majority by force, by driving away the indigenous population. And then after they did that, after they had their cherished Jewish majority, they could establish a state which portrays to be a democracy, because they have already controlled which population is living on that land. And then they made sure by law that those who have been expelled will never be allowed to come back. And those who remained on their land, because they didn't manage to expel everyone, will be denied equal rights. So by definition, legally speaking, I am a privileged Israeli Jew, because by law I have preferential treatment over other citizens of the state who do not belong to the same ethnicity that I belong to. So we can move on to the next slide. I guess that you're seeing a multi-layered system of control.
Yeah.
Okay, so I took the left side. This is a direct quote from the wonderful UN report on Israeli apartheid. The full title is below: Israeli practices towards the Palestinian people and the question of apartheid. And on the right side, this is an infographics from Visualizing Palestine, which produces excellent infographics like the one you're seeing here. And they both basically talk about the same thing. From the legal perspective, which is on the left side, the UN report on apartheid divides the Palestinian community into 4 domains, and it argues that all 4 domains are under the control, or at least suffering from, directly suffering from the practice of apartheid as is being practiced by Israel. And these include the ones who are citizens of the state but are unequal citizens. As I said, by law they are discriminated against, or they do not have the same rights as I do. Then you have a smaller group, which are residents of Jerusalem, which are not citizens of the state. They are regarded as residents. And Israel did that. They created this category, legal category, because they wanted to annex East Jerusalem after the War of '67, just that they didn't want to take the people along with that. So they had to create a new group of people, or a new legal group, which would be Israeli residents. They are regarded as permanent residents, even though their permanency is very much in question. They live in a very precarious situation. So if any East Jerusalemite who may have been living in Jerusalem for years, for their family has been living in Jerusalem for generations, if they come to study at the University of Oregon, for example, and they remain there for over 3 years, they may lose the right to ever go back home. Even if they live, let's say they marry someone from Ramallah, which is only 15 minutes away, and they move to live in Ramallah because their spouse cannot move from Ramallah back to East Jerusalem, even though this is all part of the same territory. Israel would not allow that, so they have to move 15 minutes away to live in Ramallah, and they stay there for too long. They can lose the right to ever go back home. They can see their house from Ramallah, but they can not visit anymore if they do not maintain their residency status and make sure that they do not lose that residency status. So their situation is very precarious. Then we move on to the other group, which lives under harsh, brutal military occupation since 1967, since Israel occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. It also occupied the Golan Heights. And the people living under this harsh military occupation are denied their basic rights, including freedom of movement and even the right to life, especially when we talk about the people in Gaza, whose situation is unbearable, and actually there are no words to describe how dire the situation is in Gaza. It is enough to say that Israel formulated formulas to count the caloric intake for the people there. Just think what that means. Just think about the level of control that Israel exercises on Gaza, where it actually goes as far as counting calories for people. And what does that tell us about that type of regime? And secondly, as a matter of policy, 95% of the water in Gaza is toxic, even more than 95%. It is not fit for human consumption. This is as far as Israel goes. This in itself is at best a monstrous decision by the Israeli government to have people living under such situation where they don't even have access to potable water. And we could talk about Gaza for hours. And then finally, and even most importantly, are those who are denied the right to go back home, who are stateless and statusless to this day. And they are the Palestinian refugees who are outside of Palestine, and there's roughly 6 million of them. So all these 4 groups, from those who are second-class citizens in Israel to the ones who are outside of the land, who may be living, if they're lucky, they may be living in the US, but they are still have every right to go, those who have been expelled and their children and grandchildren still have the right to go back home, but are denied that right for the past 7 decades. These are the people that we're talking about. So if we can move on to the next slide. there's this table with many numbers on it. So we don't have to go into that, but I created this table just a few days ago as a response to some Zionist propaganda article that I came across in a supposedly progressive media outlet, which questioned whether Israel is a democracy. And it's very good that they questioned whether Israel is a democracy, only that when they looked at the numbers, because we're facing where there's this upcoming election soon in Israel, Palestine. So they questioned, okay, who is entitled to vote under that regime? And then they counted the ones who may vote, who have suffrage versus those who cannot, whether basically those who are under military control and also those who are residents of East Jerusalem and do not have the right to vote. And indeed, the situation is dire, and they say that it is questionably a democracy. Only that article, even though it was well-meaning and trying to question how democratic Israel is, that article forgot the main part of the argument, which is those 6 million in the diaspora, those who are denied the right to go back home. So I created this table, and you don't have to go through each and every category here, but just to show you that at the top you have those who are the privileged, belong to the privileged group, and they amount to no more than about 1/3 of the population, or 1/3 of the stakeholders, and then 2/3 are the ones who are denied their basic rights. The very at the top of the green part, you have those who actually have a voting right, only that their voting right means absolutely nothing, because by law they cannot challenge Israeli apartheid. If they choose to challenge Israeli apartheid, ethnic supremacy, and so on, they would not even be able to run for elections. And then all the rest do not even have voting rights, and some of them do not even have the right to live on their own land. So when we look at it in this way, any article in the media that discusses Israeli democracy is a joke. It's really, there's no words to describe how Orwellian it is to discuss Israeli democracy, for example. Even when it doesn't matter whichever way you want to dissect it. Okay, it's very convenient for Israelis to say, well, we have a democracy, or what seems to be like a democracy within whatever regarded as Israel proper, within the limited territory, because that's convenient for them to say that. But these are not the actual numbers that we should be considering. The only numbers that are relevant are the entire table here. More than 18 million, probably, these are estimates, so I don't want to give you an exact number and then that you may be able to prove me wrong, because these are only estimates. We don't know for a fact the numbers, but these are quite actually conservative estimates. But let's say that we have over 18 million people, over 19 million people who should have their rights under that regime, but only 1/3 of them, only roughly 7 million of them, actually receive rights. And that's the situation that we're dealing with. So the BDS campaign, that I will talk about in a moment, basically claims that all of these people have rights, and the question is, how do we demand the implementation of the rights of all the people of that land? We can move to the next slide. Now, I just want to give you an example of the type of mentality behind the Zionist project in Palestine and Zionism in general. As far as I know, there's only two types of Zionists. There are those who are right-wing and proud of it. There are those who say, yes, this is ours and only ours, and there is no problem with that, because that's how they think. They don't try to come across as liberal or democratic and so on. And these are also the ones who are currently the acting government. And then you have the other type of Zionists that I will talk about in a moment, which have painted this rosy picture of Zionism, this kind of liberal, pseudo-liberal facade of Zionism, and they try to juggle this thing about being liberal and Zionist at the same time, moral and Zionist at the same time. And I will talk about them in a second. So the first type of Zionists, the ones who are unashamed of being racist, supremacist, and so on, saying, yes, we are actually dealing with basically a situation which gives preferential treatment for one group of people based on their ethnicity. One good example for that is the guy being quoted here, Benny Morris, a historian. He actually, as a historian, he did quite good job in uncovering the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, which took place, the majority of it took place in 1948. But at the same time, in this interview, he says the following. He says that actually it was necessary to uproot the Palestinians, 700,000 of them at the time. There was no choice but to expel that population, because without uprooting them, without expelling them, the Zionists wouldn't have their cherished majority. They would have to live alongside the others, the Palestinians, as the partition plan offered, but they did not want that. And then he carries on and says something interesting to the interviewer. He says the following: I know that this stuns the Arabs and the liberals and the politically correct types, but my feeling is that this place would be quieter and no less suffering if the matter had been resolved once and for all. If Ben-Gurion had carried out a large expulsion and cleansed the whole country, the whole land of Israel as far as the Jordan River, it may yet turn out that this was his fatal mistake. So basically what Morris is saying is that Ben-Gurion's gravest mistake was that he hasn't finished the job, that there are still Palestinians left in Palestine. If he had managed to totally expel them from their land, then basically problem would be solved for these types of Zionists, because then they would be basically an absolute majority, or they would be the absolute population, and then those who claim their rights are totally away from their land, and as far as he's concerned, at least, the problem would be solved. Those who expelled the Palestinians were also under the impression, and they wrote this, Ben-Gurion wrote it in his diaries and many others, they were absolutely certain that within 2 or 3 generations, Palestinian refugees will forget about that yearning to go back home. And they will have to adjust and to adapt to whatever situation they're in. But what we see is that they are still demanding their right to go home. Okay, so that's one type of Zionism. And then if we can move on to the next slide, we have the other type of Zionism, what's called liberal Zionism. And I chose this guy, who is regarded as a peacenik. He has the Nusayba Yalon Peace Initiative under his name. He was also the former head of the Mossad. Sorry, the former head of the Shin Bet. And he says the following. Actually, he said that in a J Street conference, which tells you also something about J Street and like-minded organizations. And he says the following, and he comes from the so-called liberal perspective. He says, if we are not a majority in our country, we do not have the right to dictate anything. Our identity is a Jewish democracy. Okay, so only if we're a majority we can actually dictate. If we are not the majority, there is no Zionism. And he says that. He says it very clearly in the speech that he gives. If we are not the majority, there is no Zionism. I don't think that I have that quote here. And then he carries on. This is why for us it is a condition to see a Palestinian state on the other side of the border. Not because they deserve it, not because we love them, because this is existential for us. And he carries on, and he even goes as far as saying, I can describe a scenario in which we shall create a two-state reality without a Palestinian partner, and we have the military power in order to take the risk. Our identity is existential. Okay, so it is existential. It is of utmost importance for those so-called liberal Zionists to have a Palestinian state. Not because they care about Palestinian rights, not because they acknowledge the existence of Palestinians, because they need to make sure that they remain the majority by any means necessary. And the best way to remain a majority, other than creating another form of ethnic cleansing, is to simply separate themselves from as many Palestinians as possible. And this is what is the underlying reasoning of the so-called two-state solution, which I'm happy to say is officially dead by now. So the two-state solution is no longer viable, and that's a very positive outcome. Okay, so these are the two types of Zionism, and I can elaborate on that. Finally, maybe let's see if we have anything else before. Okay, yeah, one more slide. another quote. This is from Golda Meir, who was Prime Minister of Israel. And she discusses something that's also in the news these days, which is the whole issue of mixed marriages in Israel, Jews marrying non-Jews, a very scary concept in Israel. This is part of a long discussion in the Israeli apartheid parliament in 1970, where they discussed the whole issue of Israeli nationality. And I'll talk about that in a second. And then she says something like, she says the following. She talks about mixed marriages, I remind you. Whoever says or thinks that this is not a duty of the state of Israel is mistaken. Mixed marriages, protecting against mixed marriages. It is perhaps our first duty after state security and linked to it. It is worth it, regretfully, to pay any price. I know that there is no guarantee that a Jew will remain a Jew and that his children and grandchildren will remain Jewish if they are not in Israel. I consider this the most important thing with a capital T. Without this, nothing else matters. In the rest of the long speech that she gives, which is very interesting, and she contradicts herself many times, she also compares the issue of mixed marriages to another calamity that hit us, as she put it, referring to the Holocaust. That not only that we had to undergo the Holocaust not too long ago, now we have another Holocaust in the making, which is the issue of basically mixed marriages. This is the type of thinking of these people. And she is among the so-called liberal group. So when I talk about exclusivity, this is what I'm referring to. This really fear, being terrified of either living with the others or even worse, actually having a shared type of life, shared state, possibly even sharing a household with those who are not among the privileged group. That's the type of thinking of Zionism, and I would argue that's the type of thinking of every aspect of Zionism with no exception. So finally, and then we can move on to talk about all sorts of things that you have on your mind. Let's move to 2 slides from here, where there's like the ID, the nationality slide. Do we have that?
Yeah, got it.
Great. So this happens to be my identity card on the left side, when I still had some hair, and my passport on the right side. Now, you may have noticed in the previous spreadsheet that you saw in the previous table that between the different groups of the privileged and the underprivileged people, there were categories. I put down citizenship, nationality, religion. As a privileged Israeli Jew, my citizenship is Israeli, but my nationality is not Israeli because there's no such thing. My nationality, according to the state, is Jewish. My fellow citizens in Israel, who are not among the privileged group, they would also be Israeli citizens, but their nationality would be different. For example, their nationality would be Arab or Druze or Circassian, and I put them in the green part of that table. Now, because Israel does this distinction, there's also another category, which is religion, which is not important, but there's also some people who the state doesn't acknowledge as being religious Jews. For example, if they cannot prove their Jewishness based on whatever religious criteria, because some part is controlled by the religious institutions. We can talk about that, why that is so. So you have some people, for example, who are still among the privileged group, who have citizenship Israeli, nationality Jewish, religion, no religion. This is very possible in Israel because the citizenship part, citizenship Israeli, means that all those who are citizens of that state play this pseudo-democratic game. They are entitled to vote to the parliament, for example, only that if they don't belong to the privileged group, their vote means absolutely nothing. Then you have the nationality part, which is the most important part. The only important part in Israel is what's written in the nationality part. If they wouldn't be able to segregate people based on their so-called nationality, then there wouldn't be the state of Israel anymore. Or there wouldn't be the Zionist project in Palestine anymore. Because everything about that project is the possibility to segregate and separate between those who are the privileged group, which have nationality equals Jewish, to the others. So they define nationality as Jewish, even though it has absolutely nothing to do with Jewish religion. It has to do with ethnicity or whatever. Or in other words, Israel is so-called Jewish in one and only one way, in the same sense that South Africa during apartheid was white. Israel is Jewish just like South Africa was white. In every other respect, Israel has absolutely nothing to do with Jewish religion. And finally, there's also the category of religion. Why is that? If we go back to the mixed marriages issue, the only way to get married in Israel is under religious wedding, is to have a religious wedding. So Jews marrying Jews, Christians marry Christians, Muslims marry Muslims, Druze marrying Druze, and so on. If you want to have a mixed form of marriage, you can do that abroad. You can go to Oregon, you can get married there, you can have your certificate translated into Hebrew, and then this will be acknowledged by the state of Israel. But it is impossible to have civil marriage in Israel. And that is done for a very good reason, exactly that quote by Golda Meir earlier, that protecting against mixed marriages is the, how did you say it exactly? You know, the something with a capital T. I consider this the most important thing with a capital T. Without this, nothing else matters. So the way they do it is they only allow religious weddings inside Israel, even though Israel is proclaimed to be a secular state. And their whole criteria about who is regarded by them as Jewish has nothing to do with religion, it has to do with ethnicity. We don't have to go into that. But it so happens that for that matter, Israel also practices Sharia law. As much as they are opposed to, like to frighten the world with Sharia law and so on, actually they have 10 Sharia courts in the state of Israel, because if you have Jews marrying Jews, you need to have some sort of a rabbinical court, and if you have Christians marrying Christians, you need to have some sort of a episcopal, right, church court. And if you have Muslims marrying Muslims, you need to have Sharia courts, and there's 10 of those in Israel. So Israel is very strict about that, because this is the way for it to make sure that we don't have this dreaded notion of mixed marriages of Jews marrying non-Jews. So that's the situation now. But when we go back to my citizenship card on the left and my passport on the right, that's an interesting situation, because on the left, it says the truth, which is very racist. It says that my nationality is regarded by the state as Jewish. By the way, this has changed in the meantime, so in the computers it still says exactly the same, but on the newer identity cards, it doesn't explicitly say nationality Jewish, it says actually citizenship Israeli, which is fine, factually it is true. They just removed that part in the identity card because of some legal battles, but it doesn't change anything in the underlying principles, because in the computers, and I have the proof for that, in the computers, there is still the whole notion of Jewish nationality, because otherwise Israel would not be able to be an apartheid state. Now, on the right side, there is the passport. It seems to be that every Israeli passport is a fraudulent document, because on my passport, in Hebrew, it says the truth. It says citizenship Israeli, but that's irrelevant for the passport. But in English, it says nationality Israeli, but that is a lie. It's a gross lie. There is no such thing as Israeli nationality. Actually, this was even challenged in the Israeli courts at least twice. And that heated discussion in the Knesset that I quoted Golda Meir about was exactly about that as well, about the whole notion of wanting to arrive at something which is regarded as Israeli nationality. And we have to acknowledge that having the same nationality for all the citizens of the state, having an Israeli nationality in Israel, would undermine everything that the state is about. And even the Israeli court, the Supreme Court, which is the main vehicle of apartheid, acknowledged that. And what I just said, that having the same nationality would undermine the very character of the state of Israel, is a direct quote from that ruling against Israeli nationality. So the Israeli court, at least twice, ruled that they cannot acknowledge having an Israeli nationality, because that would undermine everything that the state is about. So, going back to the passport, what does that mean that they printed that my nationality is Israeli? That's an absolute lie, because they know that internally they can do whatever they want, but externally, if I happen to arrive in Oregon and at the airport I would show my passport and it would say the truth, it would proclaim that my nationality is Jewish, that would look very bad. And especially if the next person in line would also have an Israeli passport and it would say that their nationality is Arab, and the third one's nationality would be Druze, and so on. That would look very bad. So they know that internally they can speak one discourse, but to the general public, when they speak abroad, they have to speak a very different type of discourse. So if they had actually told us the truth, if they actually printed the truth on my passport, again, Israel would not be able to carry on with its sinister and criminal practices. Luckily for them, they've been very successful with the propaganda. That's why I said that if you've been reading the New York Times or Haaretz newspaper and so on, you would be under the assumption that there is some form of democracy in Israel. And you would be under the assumption that there is some form of an Israeli left in Israel, even though there isn't an Israeli left-wing camp. Never existed. You would be under the assumption that there is an Israel alongside Palestine. That's a lie. Israel is built on top of Palestine at the expense of the indigenous people, and on and on. You would be under the assumption that the problem started in 1967 when Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza. That's another lie. The occupation didn't start 50 years ago. It started 70 years ago. The latest form of that occupation started 50 years ago. So what I'm trying to do is to basically, without even referring to that last form of occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, but actually talking about the root of the problem, the core of the issue, by talking about that, I'm trying to undo whatever propaganda Israel was able to do for the past 7 decades. And whenever you talk about the situation in Israel-Palestine, please remember that this is what we're talking about. We're talking about establishing a state that is for one and only one group of people at the expense of all the others. Finally, and then we can hopefully open up for questions, I'm also part of the BDS campaign. I'm proud member of the Boycott, Divest, and Sanctions campaign against Israel. This is a Palestinian-led campaign. It started in July 2005. And over the past decade, a little more than a decade, I would argue that it had grown even beyond discussing Palestinian rights, and it had become basically a global awareness movement. And this is very, very encouraging. But basically, the Palestinian BDS campaign demands the 3 fundamental rights of the Palestinians, meaning equality, freedom, and justice. These are the values that can be basically implemented via these 3 rights. And the 3 rights are: those who are living under this harsh, brutal military occupation in the West Bank and Gaza obviously deserve to be free from that occupation. I think that goes without saying. It's quite obvious. Those who are currently second-class citizens in the state of Israel, who are not among the privileged group like myself, and there are more than 50 laws that discriminate against them in every possible way, deserve to have full equality. Also, no-brainer. It's pretty much goes without saying. And finally, and most importantly, those who have been ethnically cleansed and are refugees to this day and yearn to go back home for the past 7 decades deserve that right to go back home, which is also protected under international law as refugees and also in UN Resolution 194. So all of these 3 rights, ending of the occupation of 67, but also the 2 other rights that relate to the foundation of the state, equality for those who are second-class citizens, and the rights of the refugees who have been expelled, have to be implemented. And this is all that the BDS campaign is about. What the Palestinian-led campaign says is we demand these 3 rights. They are protected by international law and human rights conventions. And until such a time that these rights are being implemented, we call on you, the international community, to apply pressure on Israel by means of boycott, divestment, and sanctions on Israel. Sounds very fair to me. Basically, I don't think that any of us questions the legitimacy of the boycott campaign against apartheid South Africa at the time. Maybe at the time, people were questioning that, but I don't think that many of us think that boycotting South Africa for its crime of apartheid was exaggerated or far-reaching. And after a long campaign of BDS campaigns against South Africa, along with many other changes that took place, geopolitical changes, eventually apartheid South Africa had been abolished. It doesn't mean that South Africa, the state, was abolished. It just had to undergo a very serious transformation, and it is actually still undergoing that transformation, because apartheid by law is over, but apartheid in practice is still alive and kicking, and they still have some way to go. We are in Israel-Palestine, we still need to undergo the first step of acknowledging the crime. We don't have any land acknowledgement. We do not acknowledge any of the indigenous people that had been living there only 70 years ago. Some of them are actually living still just across the fence, or maybe just a few kilometers away. So we haven't even acknowledged the crimes, let alone trying to fix these crimes. So what the BDS campaign does is brings into public awareness this whole notion of the crimes on the one hand and how to fix these crimes, how to demand these basic rights, which basically align with the three fundamental values of equality, freedom, and justice. Again, a no-brainer. I don't think it's far-reaching. I don't think that, you know, in the French Revolution, when they were demanding liberté, égalité, fraternité, which is pretty much equality, freedom, and justice, I don't think that any of us has an issue with that. And I'm calling on you to endorse the BDS campaign for basically advocating for the most fundamental rights for all the people of that land, not at the expense of not one group at the expense of the other, but demanding the same rights, full rights for all the 18 or 19 million people of that land. Thank you.
Thank you. We could take a few questions.
Sure.
If you wanted to raise your hand, I could get to you. You have a question? Yeah, Josh.
Thank you, Ronnie. I would normally let other people go first, but I have to leave in 2 minutes, so I'm going to go first. My question is about strategy. So what is your opinion on whether or not there is a space in the boycott movement for any kind of liberal Zionist? Because I am a BDS activist, and I sometimes encounter resistance from well-meaning good people who say they won't be part of it because it alienates well-meaning people in Israel who want justice and freedom for Palestinians, but they don't want to give up the Jewish majority, and so they won't participate in boycott for that reason. How to talk with those people?
Okay, very good question. Thank you. I would say that liberal Zionism is the greatest threat to realizing Palestinian rights. The main form of Israeli propaganda is not the one coming from the right wing. It's not the one that is totally convoluted and makes up all kinds of facts that never existed. The main form of propaganda is that which tries to and apartheid. It is basically pretty much every article that you will read on Haaretz newspaper, for example. Haaretz, which is regarded as a critical voice in Israel. So without even going to the specific organizations, and I'm very happy to talk about all of them, the first and foremost criteria, as far as I'm concerned, to demand rights or to basically to collaborate around the issue of Palestinian rights is if the partners agree on these rights. It doesn't mean that they have to advocate for these rights. For example, you may know the Jewish Voice for Peace, which is a wonderful organization that is now explicitly supporting the BDS campaign. For many years, they were supporting it, but not explicitly so. So they said, okay, for some reason or another, our constituents, our members, maybe for them this is going too far. We may talk about settlement products. We may talk about equality or the current inequality inside Israel. But, you know, discussing the right of return, that's possibly going a little too far for some of our members. So we will not talk about it much. But they were never opposed to these rights. They acknowledged the right, and they said, at the moment, we cannot afford publicly, explicitly, campaigning for the right of return. Okay, fair enough. And they were a very instrumental and very important part of the BDS campaign in the US. They have become even more so when they explicitly endorsed BDS, and actually this came from their own membership. Their members said, actually, you are not going far enough. We need you to explicitly support BDS. We feel that by not doing so, we are actually not doing enough. So it is very interesting that actually there was this form of radicalization in a way within JVP members, and actually this also allowed for other people to join in. So actually they have grown dramatically over the past years, and this is a very encouraging phenomenon. At the same time, we see other, let's talk about American Jews for a moment, because we already touched on JVP. We see other American Jews who, in the polls, we can clearly see that they are distancing themselves from their support of Israel. So they grew up in Zionist households to blindly support the state of Israel. But the more that Israel becomes explicitly racist, more unapologetically racist, Zionist, meaning the right-wing parties, the right-wing administration is in power and they are legislating all these crazy laws. This doesn't fit in with their liberal type of thinking, okay? Those American Jews who, on the one hand, grew up to be Zionists, but also to think in somewhat of a liberal type of thinking. And we see a very clear shift in the polls of those American Jews who, at the very least, are distancing themselves from Israel. They cannot blindly support Israel anymore. And they find themselves in a weird situation, and I believe that many of them find themselves active in one way or another in all these liberal Zionist organizations, like J Street, or If Not Now, and so on. Now, I believe that this liberal Zionist discourse is there in order to act as a buffer for people to transition from Zionism to humanism. Because there's nothing in between, actually. Either you're a fascist or an anti-fascist. Either you're a Zionist or an anti-Zionist. There's either you're supremacist or opposed to supremacy. There's nothing in between. Now, this type of liberal Zionism tries to cushion that transition and to act as a buffer and to create this false discourse about so-called liberal Zionism, which actually doesn't exist, never existed. So, on the one hand, I'm here to kind of say, actually, to encourage people to take the extra mile and to undergo this transition, even if it is a painful process for some of them, to abandon the safety of their Zionist thinking and to actually make a full transition into what the rest of the world thinks. And at the same time, I'm not here to say that I will never cooperate with any liberal Zionist, but the condition is whether they support the three rights of the Palestinians. They don't have to endorse, they don't have to publicly, explicitly call for all these rights in any condition, but I will not accept them saying we only support two rights, but we negate the third. Then, as far as I'm concerned, they would not be my allies.
Thanks. Any other questions?
What do you see the end game being? What is to be the result of BDS if you repeal all those 4950 discriminatory laws? You see Palestinians having control of the legislature? Because I don't. I think that it will stay pretty much the way it is. The money is there. The ability to campaign and convince people to follow you is there. And so I would imagine that the Jewish majority in the Knesset is going to stay that way. And there will still be control. However, there'd be more freedom for Palestinians without the walls and the lines and the rotten laws. But what do you see as the end game?
Yeah. Thanks. So I'll answer in two parts. First of all, I think that the BDS campaign is the short-term approach, or it's the how shall I say? There are two stages here. There's what we need to do in the short run, and then in the long run. In the short term, we need to end Israeli crimes, just like we need to end apartheid in South Africa, we needed to end slavery in the US, etc. We need to end these crimes. That in itself is not the entire story. We also have to build something that is based on everything that's opposed to what Israel is based on at the moment, which respects the rights of all those people, which actually is something that will allow us to live together as equals in that territory, under 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 states. It doesn't matter at all. So the BDS campaign is about ending crimes. It's about ending the occupation of 67 and ending the discriminatory nature within 48, or what is regarded as Israel proper, and ending of the horrible situation of refugees in the diaspora who are denied the right to go back home for 7 decades. That is super important, At the same time, we're also working, each one of us in their own capacity, about sowing the seeds for what will happen afterwards. Just like I said about South Africa, the fact that they ended apartheid, legal apartheid, doesn't mean that South Africa stopped its apartheid practices. The fact that slavery, legal slavery, ended in the US doesn't mean that there is no slavery by other means. You know about what's her name? The new Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander, and speaking about how slavery has basically transitioned into the prison industrial complex, and on and on. And you know about obviously the movement for Black Lives and so on. So the fact that we end the crime in itself doesn't necessarily mean that we have ended the process or ended the you know, our mission. So then going to the parliament, which is currently the Israeli Knesset, which is an apartheid parliament by definition, which is wholly illegitimate, I refuse to vote to that parliament. If we can, Azim, if we can go to the slide, 2 slides from now, I think, I don't know which one you're seeing, but it says voting and participation. I'll explain to you why the Israeli parliament is entirely illegitimate.
I got it up.
Great.
Yeah.
The top part is a direct quote from the Israeli Basic Law. There is no constitution in Israel. If there was a constitution, there wouldn't be apartheid. The constitution would safeguard the rights of all the people of that land, or at least all the citizens. Hence, no apartheid. If there was an Israeli citizenship, Israeli nationality, rather than Jewish nationality, again, the same thing, there would be some basis for equality. Equality is the most radical notion that I can speak of in Israel. If there was equality, that's it, problem solved. Now, how do they make sure that there is no equality, or that those who are subjugated second-class citizens cannot challenge racial domination? There is a basic law, which is akin to a constitution, but there is no constitution. A basic law is a law that is very, very difficult to change. And the law says that the candidate list cannot run for elections if it negates Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. By the way, there is an amendment to that law saying that not only if the party negates Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, even a member, anyone who runs for elections, if they express themselves, even over Facebook for that matter, denying the legitimacy of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, meaning if they are advocating for full equality, for full democracy, they cannot even run for elections. They will be barred from elections. So this is the law. And then the excellent UN report on apartheid, written by Killian Falk, they discuss the very law in their report, and they say that this is analogous to voting rights, given voting rights to slaves, but denying them to vote against slavery. Now let's read that together. Voting rights lose their significance in terms of equal rights when a racial group is legally banned from challenging laws that perpetuate inequality. An analogy would be a system in which slaves have the right to vote, but not against slavery. So that's the way I see the Israeli parliament today. This is why I refuse to vote to any party, including the Palestinian parties that participate in that parliament, because I see the entire parliament as illegitimate. Now, obviously, I am not in a position to tell those who are subjugated second-class citizens what they should do. But as far as I'm concerned, I would very much rather see them not participate in that parliament and try to challenge the system from outside, rather than acting in one way or another to legitimate that system. I understand that they are how is it called in English, between the rock and the hard plate, between the
rock and hard.
Yeah, you know what I mean. So yeah, they're not in an easy situation, and I understand that there are different considerations around that. But as far as I'm concerned, I'm not willing to lend legitimacy to that parliament, period. What will happen in the future? Obviously, there would be such a radical transformation, because Israel-Palestine would have to transform into something that it is currently totally against. We will have to have a constitution. We'll have to enshrine to protect the rights of all the people of that land. That means that everything that we know about Israel would have to transform dramatically. And then, obviously, the parliament that will exist, or the parliaments in plural that will exist, will respect the rights of all those people of that land in the different territories, or one parliament for all, or whichever constellation that time. And then we will be able to actually establish something that is sane and moral and respects the rights of all. But this will definitely not be under the existing parliament, which is by definition an apartheid parliament.
Thanks for the thorough answer. Any other questions? Thanks.
I really appreciate your presentation. I'm curious about the title "Boycott from Within." Now, what actions can you actually take within Israel? You mentioned not voting in parliamentary elections, but what more can you do within Israel to further the BDS movement?
Right. So, as far as the BDS campaign goes, those who are living under Israeli apartheid, especially the Palestinians of them, it is understood that there's only so much that they can do. We are not asked not to purchase in the supermarket, even though, we and many other things, even though we would support in one way or another criminal policies of the state, at least by our tax, by paying taxes. We're not asked not to go to the university. By the way, we should also remember that even Nelson Mandela studied law in an apartheid university at the time. So we're not asked not to engage with Israeli society or with the institutions. We are obviously doing our best not to lend legitimacy to certain things that are clearly illegitimate. So we are also not asked not to participate in the parliament, by the way, but in the BDS framework. Now, when we say that the name of the group, Boycott from Within, is a little misleading, because that's the short and catchy name, but actually the full name is important, because the full name is Boycott Supporting the Palestinian BDS Call from Within. So it's not so much about what we do from within, in the sense of boycotting from within. It is more about our role as the privileged Israeli Jews who support the underprivileged in their struggle, in their very just call for BDS. So in my capacity as a privileged Israeli Jew, maybe I can do certain things that other people can't. I am being silenced less, or at least I have not been taken to prison for speaking up the way that I just did. And if I was a Palestinian in the very same situation, I would probably be in prison by now, even if I was a citizen of the state. I should remind you that, for example, the wonderful poet Darin Tatur, she spent time in prison and then under house arrest simply for publishing a poem on Facebook. And other such people who have simply expressed themselves in a way that Israel doesn't like, they suffer the consequences, especially if they are not among the privileged group. So I use my privilege. With privilege comes responsibility. So, I act, I do whatever I can with my privilege to speak up and to oppose the crimes that are performed by Israel. So what we do is basically, it's obviously not about the numbers. We are not a large group of people who are Israeli dissidents and oppose Israeli crimes from within. By the way, I spend the time between Israel and Germany these days. So I'm speaking to you from Berlin now. Why Berlin, of all places? Before that, I was living in Italy. Because I feel that it is actually, personally speaking, I feel that it is actually irresponsible of me to live in Israel at the moment, because I can be more effective outside in order to change the situation inside by doing whatever I do. And especially so in Berlin, because Berlin is pretty much the last bastion for Zionism, the last frontier for Zionism. So here, again, being the Israeli Jew that I am, I can do certain things that other people cannot or are afraid of doing, because there is a lot of repression here about freedom of expression whenever it comes to Israel-Palestine. So I can speak up a little more freely, and I don't care so much about all kinds of false accusations against me. Actually, we will be in court at the beginning of March 4th in Berlin, and I'm very proud of that and very happy about that opportunity. We are 3 activists, 2 Israeli dissidents and 1 Palestinian from Gaza, we are all dear friends, but also activists who have challenged an Israeli member of of Parliament, member of Knesset, who was speaking here in Berlin. And you can see that on video. I can send you the link, and there's also a public statement that we made about that. And we challenged her legitimacy, speaking in a Berlin university, Humboldt University. And I was actually holding that UN report in my hand, accusing Israel of the crime of apartheid. I told her that she was an illegitimate representative because she's a representative of a criminal apartheid regime, and on and on. In our statement, we quoted from that UN report, and now we're taken to court in Berlin for that. And that's a wonderful opportunity for us to take Israel to court. Basically, the Berlin prosecution is taking us to court for criminal charges, very minor criminal charges, but yet criminal charges, and that's a wonderful opportunity for us to have our day in court and to take Israel to court for practicing the crime of apartheid and other crimes. So stay tuned, and this will happen at the beginning of March.
Yeah, thanks for letting us know. I'm gonna follow that for sure. Any other questions? Sorry.
Those kind of pro-Israel or you can't talk against Israel laws are happening here quite badly. I think the Senate is still considering that horrible Senate 1, which would give you fines if you talk against Israel in the United States, where free speech is supposed to be sacred. And yet 27 states have anti-BDS laws. I don't know, what the heck do we do? We need to do something.
My main suggestion is not to be discouraged. I think that these are actually very good signs, actually, because Israel is definitely losing its status in the world. It is aligning itself, by the way, with the most racist, even fascist regimes in the world. You know, just recently Netanyahu was in Brazil, embracing Bolsonaro, and with Orban in Hungary and so on. Like, basically, Israel is more and more being affiliated with extreme right-wing, even some neo-Nazi groups around the world, selling them weapons, by the way. It's all documented. Now, so we are actually in a position where Israel is terrified of the BDS campaign, a campaign that is totally decentralized, distributed, which is run by volunteers, and which is basically challenging, yes, indeed, challenging everything that the state of Israel is about, like I try to explain. Now, obviously, there wouldn't be a boycott of Israel if it simply respected the rights of the Palestinians, but this is not something that they are willing to do. So it is up to us, the people, to stand up. Also to stand up to our politicians. In the US, you have to stand up to your politicians who are unfortunately still embracing Israel. And are, you know, there is a shift happening, and we know that behind closed doors, they say one thing, but to the cameras, they say something else. So to the cameras, they are still very much in support of Israel. But there is definitely a shift. There's definitely a change happening, even within the administration, even within the group of American Jews, for example, and etc. But I believe that one example for this change is these types of legislation that are happening. And this is a very, very good sign. If we were not effective, they wouldn't be bothered about legislating such laws. The fact that they do, and the fact that they go as far as legislating such laws that go directly against the American Constitution, freedom of expression, for example, is outrageous. It's funny. But you shouldn't be discouraged, actually. On the contrary, this would be kind of, you know, you should pat yourself on the shoulder and carry on doing whatever you do, because this is a very good sign that we are actually winning. Besides, I think that this also causes many people to question, just like I mentioned, American Jews who are forced into questioning their whole blind support for Israel, also other people around the world and in the US, by seeing these types of activities that are being carried out by Israel. It forces them to rethink, to recalculate where they stand on this matter. Maybe they will not go as far, as I said, as being anti-Zionist. Maybe they will find some niche, some possible place in between, even though I don't believe that that place in between is viable. But they are definitely questioning, and that is a very, very important shift that we are seeing. So I am actually very much encouraged by these types of legislation. At the same time, I know it's not fun, but it's not fun, but it is necessary probably. And in the long run, or in the historical perspective, I think that this will A, be a very short period of time, and B, a transition period. So I think it's a very good reason for optimism.
No point. Yeah, great points. I couldn't agree more. I think we have time for a couple more. Go ahead.
Thanks. I love your clarity and your spirit. This is good. Very helpful to me. And I am concerned about Boycott Within because there's legislation coming through the Knesset. So I'm just wondering what your, I don't know, just you know, I have feelings. Don't worry about you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, first of all, again, like it's very important and nice to hear that, you know, that there is this concern, and I'm very happy to hear that. At the same time, personally, at least, I don't feel as intimidated by the administration. But then again, there's enough crazy people out there. And I can tell you about my personal experience. I can tell you about more general stories. But yes, there are many crazy people out there. Many of them also in Israel. Everything is, you know, everything is possible. Everything is, you know, we should sort of, I think that in general, as activists, we should overcome fear. You know, it's not that we shouldn't fear, but we should overcome that in order to be able to do political work, to do activism. Because fear, or in the case of Germany, this guilt trip that many Germans have, this is a very debilitating factor. So I choose to speak about responsibility rather than about fear and so on. You know, I have a certain type of responsibility, possibly even more even than other people, simply because I am living under that situation where I am, whether I want it or not, I am among the privileged group living at the expense of the others. So with that privilege comes, there's also responsibility. So that's my driving force. Now about, you see, if they legislate, they already legislated against us in 2011, and there was an anti-BDS law that was legislated. I was very excited about that. Obviously, in our statement, we titled it "We Will Not Be Silent," taking inspiration from German dissidents, the White Rose movement, who have that quote, that slogan. So we titled our statement "We Will Not Be Silent," and you know why we actually reiterated our support of the BDS campaign and calling on others to boycott Israel. So I think that, again, we shouldn't be shy about it. We shouldn't be apologetic about it. We should stand for what we believe in, regardless of what the administration is doing, regardless of what laws they legislate against us. If they want to take me to jail, great, let them. It wouldn't be fun, but taking, so as I said, they take Palestinians, they bring Palestinians to jail all the time. I mean, they incarcerate Palestinians all the time. That's not even newsworthy, unfortunately, for most of the news channels. If they would treat myself or people like me in the same manner, I believe that this would kind of signal the demise of Israeli apartheid, and B, I think that it would be, yes, it would. Israel is very careful. It's doing its calculation about how they treat people like myself, because they know that this will backfire. And you know, if something like this happens, it's up to you guys to make sure that this backfires in their faces. That's your role.
I think one last question. If anybody got one? I have one. If nobody has one. So my question is, as far as I know, how I understand BDS from like in academia at least, or like from universities, it's like largely symbolic, right? Like, so University of Oregon down 40 minutes away from us divested last year, I think. And when I sat with administrators to get OSU to try to divest without going through our student government, they gave us like a rundown of why they can't do that because it's a public institution and all those things.
Yeah.
So I guess I want to ask you, like, would it be, is it kind of like worth the effort to do it just symbolically through like universities, or like, yeah, does that make sense, that question at all?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
So my answer is absolutely yes.
Okay,
I
cool.
think that much of what we do is on the symbolic level. And I gave this example recently. We recently hosted Professor Richard Falk, who actually the co-author of the UN report on apartheid. He was in Berlin. We hosted him. He endorsed us, the 3 activists who disrupted the member of Knesset in Humboldt. And he's a legal scholar discussing apartheid. So it was a very interesting and wonderful discussion that we had ahead of our upcoming trial. And I also touched on that issue of how symbolism is very important. So basically, do you know the story of Ahed Tamimi, the girl who slapped the soldier and spent quite a long time in jail in a military prison for slapping a fully armed Israeli soldier who was basically invading her home? And this was obviously recorded, it was on video, and therefore, because of that, she was arrested the next day and spent a long time in prison. By the way, also her mother spent a long time in prison for that, and many of her relatives, etc. Think about it. This young teenager slapping a fully armed Israeli soldier, obviously posing no threat to that soldier, spending time in jail for doing so. This is only about symbolism, and Israel is terrified of that. Symbolism is powerful in that sense, because we will not bring down the 4th largest nuclear superpower in the world with weapons. It's not that, by the way, it's not that the armed struggle, Palestinian armed struggle, is illegitimate. It is legitimate under international law. When I talk about the armed struggle, I'm talking about struggling against armed forces, not against civilians. It is legitimate, but I'm not sure it's the most effective thing to do. We have more effective things to do, for example, the BDS campaign, which proves to be very effective. So when this girl, teenager, slaps a soldier, she spends time in jail for doing that, and by doing so also becoming a Palestinian icon. They chose the wrong teenager to mess with. When we filmed on the fence of the Gaza ghetto, during the March of Return, the Great March of Return, which took place and still takes place in Gaza. And when we were filming Israeli soldiers there, we were a bunch of Israeli activists, not too many, filming Israeli soldiers. We were calling them terrorists because that's what they are. We were saying other things about the things that they were doing. And one of these videos went viral. And because it went viral, immediately there was the response from Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, from Lieberman, the former Minister of Defense. They are even legislating a law these days, specifically in response to that one video, saying that it will be illegal to film soldiers on duty. That's a very interesting outcome. Again, this is just the power of symbolism. All we did was film soldiers and call them terrorists, which is basically what they are. So this is the power of symbolism. And the last example is the reason that we are going to court now. When we disrupted this member of Knesset in a German university, and obviously this is on video, and we simply told her that she was not a legitimate representative, and for doing that we're now going to court. All of these are wonderful examples. Obviously, we do not have as much political power, certainly not lobbying. By the way, if you haven't, please watch the Al Jazeera report on the Israeli lobby, the Zionist lobby in the US. Also, there's the previous report in the UK, which exposes the lobby for what it really is. We do not have as much clout. We do not have as much political power. We do definitely not have as much funding. We have practically zero funding, but we do have truth and justice and all of that on our side. And that proves to be very effective. So we shouldn't be discouraged. We should use the power of symbolism. This is one thing that we do have in our hands. And passing a resolution within the university is super important because it's an educational tool for the students. And it is powerful in the sense of expressing this voice that is unfortunately lacking in the, let's say, US administration. If the American politicians would have done their share, that by law they're not even allowed to sell weapons to Israel, according to their own US laws, let alone international law and so on. If the politicians would have done their share, we wouldn't have to do ours. Because they are not doing what they are supposed to do, it is up to us to boycott, then to divest. Whoever is invested, please pull out your investment or approach a university, say, we would like to invest in a socially responsible way, therefore we do not want to invest in certain companies that violate international law, certain companies that violate Palestinian rights, and so on. And finally, after boycott and after divestment, there's sanctions, but sanctions is not something that you and I can do. This is something that an international body can do and should do, whether it is the European Union, European Parliament, that is obligated by law to freeze the agreement with Israel, whether it is the US administration that is not allowed to do certain things that it does by law, the UN, which is supposed to sanction Israel. They are not doing their share, so it is up to us. So passing such a resolution would be an excellent step in the right direction, and it's not necessarily about the implication. Obviously, you should make sure that there is as much implication for it as possible, but yes, symbolism is important.
Thank you. I appreciate that answer, because I've always like debated it. Like we always have like debates about that internally with our groups. So I appreciate the answer.
And it's also a very good educational tool. Having a campaign is not only about the end result, it's also about educating people, the students especially, getting them more on board, like,
Yeah,
you know, to know what they're talking about, to know what the situation in Israel-Palestine is about. This is very important also.
yeah, I agree. And again, I just want to thank you, because I know you're in Germany, right? So I think it's like 10:30.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
I appreciate you taking the time. We appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah.
Give it up one more time for Ronnie. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night. Thank you.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Fucking March with your trial.
Good morning.
Take care.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.